The moving truck disappeared around the corner, leaving behind only tire marks on the gravel driveway and the echo of diesel engines fading into the distance. John Cena stood motionless, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the front yard of his newly purchased home. The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and promised winter, but something else lingered beneath those familiar smells, something ancient and unsettling that he couldn't quite identify. "Honey, come help me with these boxes," his wife Sarah called from the front porch, her voice bright with excitement. She had been looking forward to this move for months, eager to escape the constant attention and noise of city life. Here, on the outskirts of town, they could finally have the privacy they craved. No paparazzi hiding in bushes, no fans camping outside their gate, just peaceful silence and the promise of a normal life. John forced a smile and jogged up the steps, easily lifting the heaviest boxes that had been giving Sarah trouble. As they worked together, unpacking their belongings and arranging furniture, he tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over him the moment he first laid eyes on this house. It wasn't the house itself that bothered him. The structure was solid, well-built, with beautiful stonework and impressive wooden beams that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. The problem was something deeper, something that whispered at the edges of his consciousness, like a half-remembered nightmare. The real estate agent had been enthusiastic about the property's history, rattling off details about its construction in the 1920s and the various families who had lived here over the decades. What she hadn't mentioned, and what John discovered during their first walkthrough, was the basement door at the far end of the kitchen. It was heavy, made of dark wood that had been stained nearly black with age, and when they first opened it, the smell that wafted up from below made both of them step back instinctively. "Every old house has a musty basement," Sarah had laughed, waving her hand to dispel the odor. "It just needs some air circulation and maybe a dehumidifier. We can turn it into a great storage space, or even a home gym for you." But John had peered down those steep, narrow stairs with his flashlight, and what he saw in that brief moment made his blood run cold. The basement wasn't just old, it felt wrong. The stone walls were uneven and seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The floor was a mixture of packed dirt and rough concrete, and in one corner, he could make out what looked like a bricked-up archway, as if someone had deliberately sealed off part of the space. The whole area radiated a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the weight of secrets buried in darkness. "Let's just leave it alone for now," he had said, quickly closing the door. "We have plenty of other rooms to focus on." Sarah hadn't argued, perhaps sensing his discomfort, but he caught her glancing toward the door several times during their first week in the house. She was curious by nature, always wanting to explore and organize every corner of their living space. The locked basement represented an unfinished project, and he knew it would bother her until they dealt with it properly. For the first few weeks, life in their new home felt almost perfect. They established routines that revolved around quiet mornings, peaceful evenings, and the luxury of privacy they had missed for so long. John would wake before dawn to run along the empty country roads, his footsteps the only sound disturbing the morning stillness. Sarah planted flowers in the garden and spent hours reading on the back porch, enjoying the view of the forest that bordered their property. The neighbors were exactly the right distance, close enough to be friendly, far enough to respect their space. Mrs. Henderson from a house across the street brought them a welcome basket filled with homemade cookies and local honey. The Martins next door offered to help with yard work and recommended the best places to shop for groceries. Everyone seemed genuinely pleased to have them in the neighborhood, but nobody was pushy or invasive about John's celebrity status. But as October deepened into November, small things began to change. It started with sounds that could easily be explained away: the settling of old wood, the expansion and contraction of pipes, the normal noises that any century-old house would make. John told himself that these sounds were nothing more than the building adjusting to new occupants, learning their rhythms and routines. The first time he heard footsteps in the basement, he was sitting in his study late at night, reviewing contracts for upcoming appearances. The sound was so faint that he almost dismissed it as his imagination, but there was something about the rhythm that made him pause. The steps were slow, deliberate, paced like someone walking with purpose rather than the random settling he might expect from an empty basement. He went to the kitchen and stood beside the basement door, pressing his ear against the wood. Silence. Whatever he had heard, or thought he had heard, had stopped the moment he approached. He tested the door handle and found it still locked, just as he had left it weeks ago. The key hung on a hook nearby, untouched and slightly dusty. "Just the house getting used to us," he whispered to himself. But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. Something was different about this place, something that went deeper than old pipes and settling foundations. As he returned to his study, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched from behind that basement door, as if whatever was down there was waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The knocking started on a Tuesday night. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the floorboards directly beneath their bed. Sarah jolted awake first, her hand automatically reaching for John's arm in the darkness. He was already alert, having learned to sleep lightly during his years of travel and uncertain hotel rooms. But this sound was different from anything he had experienced before. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her fingers tightening on his bicep. Her voice carried the particular tension that comes from being woken by something unexpected, something that doesn't belong in the familiar sounds of home. John nodded silently, straining to listen for any follow-up noise. The house around them had settled into its nighttime silence. No wind rattling windows, no distant traffic, no neighbors moving around. Just the soft hum of the heating system and their own careful breathing. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. 3 deliberate strikes that seemed to come from directly below their bedroom floor, as if someone in the basement was trying to get their attention. "It's probably just pipes," John said, but his voice lacked conviction. He had heard plenty of pipe noise in various houses over the years, and this wasn't that. This had intention behind it, a purposefulness that made his skin crawl. Over the following nights, the pattern established itself with disturbing regularity. The knocking would begin around midnight, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but always following the same sequence. 3 sharp raps, a pause, then 3 more. It would continue for anywhere from 5 minutes to half an hour before stopping as abruptly as it had begun. During the day, the basement remained silent, as if whatever was causing the disturbance only felt comfortable emerging in the deepest hours of night. John's sleep began to suffer. Even on nights when the knocking didn't come, he found himself lying awake, muscles tense, waiting for that first sharp rap to shatter the silence. Sarah handled it better initially, managing to drift back to sleep after each episode. But as the days passed, the dark circles under her eyes revealed that she too was struggling with the nightly disturbances. "Maybe we should call a plumber," she suggested over breakfast one morning, stirring her coffee with unnecessary focus. "There might be air trapped in the pipes, or maybe the water pressure is causing some kind of hammering effect." John agreed, though privately he doubted any plumber would find a conventional explanation for what they were experiencing. When the plumber arrived that afternoon, a cheerful man named Pete who had serviced homes in the area for 30 years, he spent 2 hours examining every pipe, joint, and connection he could access. His final verdict was both reassuring and troubling. "Your plumbing is in excellent shape," Pete announced, wiping his hands on a rag. "No air pockets, no loose fittings, no pressure issues. Whatever noise you're hearing, it's not coming from the water system. Could be electrical, maybe some kind of settling in the foundation, but it's nothing I can fix." That night, as if responding to Pete's declaration of defeat, the knocking became more aggressive. Instead of the measured 3-rap sequence, it evolved into longer patterns, 5 knocks, then 7, then a rapid series that sounded almost frantic. The sounds weren't confined to the area beneath their bedroom anymore either. John could track movement across the basement ceiling, following what seemed like footsteps from one end of the house to the other. "This is ridiculous," he said, throwing back the covers and swinging his legs out of bed. "I'm going down there." "John, no." Sarah's voice was sharp with fear. "What if someone is actually down there? What if they're dangerous?" The possibility had occurred to him, but he couldn't imagine how anyone could be getting into their basement. The exterior doors were all locked, the windows were secured, and there were no obvious entry points that he could see. Besides, The sounds had a quality that suggested something other than human intrusion. They were too regular, too purposeful, and they never seemed to respond to external stimuli the way a person might. He grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and made his way to the kitchen, Sarah following close behind despite her protests. The basement door stood before them like a challenge, its dark wood seeming to absorb the light from the hallway fixture above. John inserted the key with steady hands and turned the lock, the mechanism clicking open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house. The smell hit them immediately, that same combination of old stone and damp earth they had noticed weeks ago, but stronger now, tinged with something metallic that made John's nose wrinkle. He flicked on the basement light, a single bulb that cast harsh shadows down the steep staircase, leaving the bottom steps invisible in darkness. "Stay here," he told Sarah, but she shook her head firmly. "We're doing this together," she said, her chin set with determination despite the fear in her eyes. They descended slowly, John leading with the flashlight beam dancing ahead of them. The basement looked exactly as it had during his previous brief inspection: stone walls, dirt floor, old wooden shelves lined with forgotten items from previous owners. But something felt different now, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. The bricked archway in the far corner seemed more prominent somehow, as if it was demanding attention rather than simply existing as part of the room's architecture. John swept the flashlight across every surface, looking for any sign of an intruder or an obvious source for the knocking. The beam revealed nothing unusual, no disturbed dust patterns, no footprints in the dirt, no evidence that anyone had been moving around down here. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if unseen eyes were tracking their every movement. "There's nothing here," Sarah whispered, but her voice carried more confusion than relief. As if responding to her words, a single, thunderous knock echoed through the basement, so loud it seemed to come from the walls themselves. Both of them jumped, John's flashlight beam wavering wildly before he regained control. They waited in tense silence for several minutes, but no further sounds came. When they finally returned to bed, neither of them spoke about what they had, or hadn't found. But John lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and wondering what secrets their new home was hiding in its depths. By the third week of disturbances, the nightly sounds had evolved from simple knocking into something far more complex and disturbing. John had started keeping a notebook beside his bed, documenting each incident with the precision of a detective building a case. The patterns were becoming clearer, and what he discovered made his blood run cold. The sounds weren't random. They followed a specific sequence that repeated every few nights. 3 knocks, silence for exactly 47 seconds, then 7 rapid taps, followed by what could only be described as footsteps crossing the basement floor from east to west. The timing never varied by more than a few seconds, as if whatever was causing the disturbance was following a precise schedule that had been established long before John and Sarah moved into the house. Sarah had stopped trying to sleep through the episodes. Instead, she would lie rigid beside him, counting along with the sounds, her hand gripping his arm with increasing desperation as each night brought new variations on the established theme. Dark circles had appeared under her eyes, and she had begun jumping at unexpected sounds during the day. The mailman's footsteps on the porch, the neighbor's dog barking, even the ice makers cycling in their refrigerator. "We can't keep living like this," she said over breakfast on a gray November morning, her coffee growing cold as she stared out the window at the bare trees surrounding their property. "I haven't had a full night's sleep in weeks. This house is making me sick." John knew she was right. The constant stress and sleep deprivation were taking their toll on both of them. He had started making mistakes during phone meetings, forgetting appointments, snapping at people who didn't deserve his frustration. Something had to be done, and conventional solutions weren't working. 3 different contractors had examined the house from top to bottom, finding no structural issues, no pest problems, no electrical faults that could explain the nightly disturbances. That evening, John made a decision that would change everything. While Sarah prepared dinner, he went to his study and pulled up the property records for their house online. If the sounds were connected to the building's history, there might be clues buried in old documents and municipal filings that could point him in the right direction. What he found sent a chill down his spine. The house had been sold 6 times in the past 40 years, with most families staying less than 2 years before moving on. The pattern was consistent. Enthusiastic new owners would move in, make improvements, then suddenly put the property back on the market. Several of the real estate listings from previous decades mentioned character features and unique historical elements, without providing specific details about what those features might be. More troubling were the gaps in occupancy. The house had stood empty for months at a time between sales, as if prospective buyers were having trouble committing to the purchase once they learned more about the property. One listing from 1987 had been pulled from the market entirely, with no explanation given in the public records. "I'm going down there tonight," John announced over dinner, his voice carrying a finality that made Sarah look up sharply from her plate. "Going where?" she asked, though they both knew exactly what he meant. "The basement. Specifically, that bricked-up section in the corner. Every contractor we've had here says it's unusual construction for a house this age. There's something behind that wall, and I'm going to find out what it is." Sarah set down her fork, her face pale in the candlelight. "John, what if it's structural? What if breaking into it brings down part of the house?" "Then we'll call a structural engineer afterward," he replied grimly. "But I can't keep living with these sounds, and neither can you. Whatever is behind that wall has been trying to get our attention for weeks. Maybe it's time we listened." After dinner, John gathered his tools from the garage: a sledgehammer, a crowbar, heavy work gloves, safety glasses, and a powerful LED flashlight that could illuminate even the darkest corners of the basement. Sarah insisted on staying upstairs, positioned by the kitchen phone with instructions to call for help if she heard anything that sounded like trouble. Standing before the basement door at 10 o'clock that night, John felt a strange mixture of determination and dread. The house around them was unnaturally quiet, as if it too was waiting to see what he would uncover. He unlocked the door and descended into the basement, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls with hollow finality. The bricked archway dominated the far corner of the room, its mortar lines casting deep shadows in the harsh LED light. Up close, John could see that the construction was indeed unusual. The bricks were a different color and texture from the rest of the basement walls, and the mortar had a newer, cleaner appearance despite decades of aging. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to seal off whatever lay beyond this barrier. John positioned himself in front of the wall and raised the sledgehammer, feeling the weight of the tool in his hands. For a moment he hesitated, remembering every horror movie he had ever seen where the protagonist makes a fatally curious decision. But the weeks of sleepless nights and his wife's growing distress pushed him forward. With a deep breath, he swung the hammer at the center of the arch. The impact sent a shockwave up his arms and filled the basement with the sound of splintering mortar. Dust cascaded from the point of impact, and several bricks shifted visibly in their settings. John swung again, this time aiming for a spot where the mortar looked particularly weathered. The second blow broke through completely, sending fragments of brick and mortar skittering across the basement floor. As the dust settled, a strange odor began to seep through the opening he had created, something stale and chemical, mixed with the metallic scent he had noticed during previous visits to the basement. John enlarged the hole methodically, using the crowbar to pry loose the damaged bricks and create an opening large enough to peer through. When he finally shone his flashlight into the space beyond the wall, what he saw made him stagger backward in shock. The hidden chamber was larger than he had expected, stretching back into darkness beyond the reach of his light beam. But it wasn't empty. Wooden crates were stacked along the walls, their surfaces covered with dust and marked with symbols and text that made John's heart race with recognition and terror. He fumbled for his phone with shaking hands, knowing that what he had discovered was far beyond anything he could handle alone. As he dialed 911, one thought echoed through his mind with crystal clarity. They had been living above a secret that someone had died to protect, and now that secret was about to change everything. John's hands trembled as he held the phone to his ear, waiting for the emergency dispatcher to answer. Through the jagged hole he had created in the basement wall, the smell continued to pour out, a mixture of old chemicals, dust, and something else that made his stomach clench with instinctive fear. The flashlight beam revealed only hints of what lay in the hidden chamber, but what he could see was enough to know that he had stumbled onto something far more serious than a simple structural mystery. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, a stark contrast to the chaos of thoughts racing through John's mind. This is John Cena at 47 Maple Ridge Road, he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. I've discovered what appears to be explosives hidden in my basement. I need the bomb squad and federal agents here immediately. The dispatcher didn't question his celebrity status or ask if this might be some kind of prank call. The urgency in his tone was enough to trigger immediate protocols. Sir, I need you to evacuate the house immediately and move at least 200 yards from the structure. Do not touch anything else in that area, and do not allow anyone else to enter the property. John ended the call and rushed upstairs, taking the steps 2 at a time. Sarah was waiting in the kitchen, her face pale with worry as she read the expression on his face. We have to leave. Now, he said, grabbing their coats from the closet. Don't ask questions, just trust me. We need to get out of the house and wait across the street until the authorities arrive. Sarah's eyes widened as she processed his words. John, what did you find down there? Something that's been hidden for decades, he replied grimly, guiding her toward the front door. Something dangerous enough that people have been trying to warn us about it for weeks. As they hurried across the street to wait on the Hendersons' front lawn, John's mind raced with the implications of what he had discovered. The nightly sounds suddenly made terrible sense. Not supernatural warnings, but the house itself responding to the instability of whatever had been sealed behind that wall. The chemical smell, the deliberate concealment, the pattern of previous owners leaving after short stays. It all pointed to a secret that multiple people had suspected but never investigated. Within minutes, the quiet suburban street erupted with activity. Police cars arrived first, their red and blue lights painting the houses in alternating waves of color. The officers immediately established a perimeter around John's property and began evacuating neighboring homes. Sarah gripped his hand tightly as they watched their new life being dismantled by official efficiency. The FBI agents arrived shortly after, followed by a specialized bomb disposal unit that John recognized from news broadcasts about terrorist threats and suspicious packages. Agent Martinez, a stern woman in her 40s, with graying hair and sharp eyes, approached them while her team began setting up equipment. Mr. Cena, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw in that basement, she said, pulling out a digital recorder. Don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem. John described his weeks of investigation, the nightly sounds that had driven him to break through the wall, and the brief glimpse he had gotten of the hidden chamber. Agent Martinez listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a tablet as he spoke. The wooden crates you mentioned, she said when he finished. Were there any markings visible? Letters, numbers, symbols? John closed his eyes, trying to recall the brief moment when his flashlight had illuminated the chamber's contents. Some of the crates had stenciled letters, but I couldn't read them clearly. There were metal containers, too, like old barrels or drums, and papers scattered on what looked like a wooden table. Agent Martinez nodded grimly. We're going to need several more hours to secure the area and examine what you found. I strongly recommend that you and your wife find somewhere else to stay tonight. This investigation is going to take time. As they waited in the Hendersons' living room, sipping coffee that tasted like ash and watching through the window as more official vehicles arrived, Sarah finally asked the question that had been hanging in the air between them. Do you think someone was planning to hurt people with whatever's down there? John considered his words carefully before answering. I think someone was planning something terrible, but for some reason, they never went through with it. The question is why they left everything behind instead of disposing of it properly. Through the window, they could see agents in protective gear disappearing into their basement with specialized equipment. Floodlights had been set up around the property, turning night into harsh artificial day. The bomb disposal robot, looking like something from a science fiction movie, was carefully maneuvered down the basement steps by its operators. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Neighbors gathered in small groups on the street, speculating about what could have triggered such a massive response. John overheard fragments of conversation, mentions of terrorism, organized crime, government conspiracies, but none of it seemed to capture the reality of what they were dealing with. This felt older somehow, like a relic from a different era that had been forgotten by everyone except the house itself. Near dawn, Agent Martinez emerged from the basement and walked directly to where John and Sarah were waiting. Her expression was grave, and she carried a manila folder thick with photographs and documents. "Mr. Cena, what you discovered appears to be a cache of explosives and planning materials dating back to the early 1960s, she said, settling into a chair across from them. "Based on preliminary examination, we believe this was connected to domestic terrorism activities during a very turbulent period in American history." She opened the folder and showed them photographs taken in the hidden chamber. John's stomach lurched as he saw clear images of what he had only glimpsed in his flashlight beam. Sticks of dynamite, timing devices, detailed maps of Boston with specific buildings marked in red ink, and typed manifesto pages outlining plans for attacks that had never been carried out. "The materials are extremely unstable after 60 years of storage," Agent Martinez continued. "If you had struck the wrong object with your sledgehammer, or if the temperature fluctuations in that basement had affected the chemical composition, the entire house could have exploded without warning." Sarah's face went white as the implications sank in. "We've been sleeping over a bomb for weeks." "Not just sleeping over it," the agent replied. "Living with it, breathing the chemical vapors seeping through that brick wall, and unknowingly contributing to its instability every time you walked across the floor above it. The sounds you've been hearing were likely caused by settling and expansion of the deteriorating materials." John felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "How long has this been down there?" "Based on the dates we've found in the documents, we estimate the cache was hidden sometime in 1963 or 1964. Someone went to considerable trouble to seal it properly, but they never came back to retrieve it. Our working theory is that the cell responsible was either arrested or killed before they could execute their plans." As the sun rose over their quiet suburban street, now transformed into a federal crime scene, John realized that their search for peaceful privacy had led them to become custodians of one of history's most dangerous secrets. The house had been trying to tell them something after all, and now that its burden had been lifted, they would have to decide whether they could ever feel safe within its walls again. The evacuation lasted 3 days. John and Sarah stayed at a nearby hotel, watching news reports about their home on television and fielding calls from reporters who somehow had obtained their contact information despite law enforcement's attempts to control the story. The media had latched onto the narrative of a famous wrestler discovering a decades-old terrorist cache, turning their private nightmare into public spectacle. "Federal agents remove over 40 pounds of explosives from celebrity home," read one headline. Another proclaimed, "John Cena's house hides Cold War terror plot." The stories were sensationalized and largely inaccurate, but they all missed the most important element of what had actually happened. The house itself had been trying to warn them from the moment they moved in. On the third morning, Agent Martinez called with an update that would change everything John thought he understood about their situation. The FBI had completed their initial analysis of the materials found in the basement, and what they discovered painted a picture far more complex than a simple abandoned terror plot. "Can you meet me at the local field office?" Martinez asked. "There are some things I need to show you that we can't discuss over the phone." An hour later, John and Sarah sat in a sterile conference room looking at evidence photographs and documents that had been carefully preserved despite their age. Martinez spread the materials across the table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that was finally beginning to form a coherent picture. "The cell we're dealing with called themselves the November Brotherhood," she began, pointing to letterhead on several of the recovered documents. "They were active in the Boston area between 1961 and 1964, during the height of Cold War paranoia and domestic unrest. Their target list included federal buildings, corporate headquarters, and what they termed symbols of capitalist oppression." She showed them photographs of detailed building plans, timing schedules, and lists of materials that painted a picture of meticulous preparation for attacks that would have killed hundreds of people. The planning was sophisticated, suggesting military or engineering training among the group's members. "What stopped them?" Sarah asked, studying a map that showed intended escape routes from downtown Boston. Martinez turned to a different set of documents, these bearing official government seals and classification stamps. That's where the story becomes truly interesting. The FBI had infiltrated the November Brotherhood by late 1963. Our agent inside the organization was named Robert Hendricks, and he had been feeding us information about their activities for months. John's attention sharpened at the familiar surname, Hendricks, like our neighbor Mrs. Hendricks. Robert Hendricks was her late husband, Martinez confirmed. He died in 1964, officially from a heart attack, but our classified files suggest he was discovered and eliminated by the Brotherhood before he could prevent their final operation. However, he had already reported the location where they were storing their materials. The pieces began falling into place in John's mind. So the FBI knew about the basement cache all along. They knew about it, but when they raided the house in 1964, they found it empty. Someone had moved everything between the time Hendricks reported the location and when agents arrived to secure it. The working theory was that the Brotherhood had discovered the infiltration and relocated their materials, but they never found evidence of where the cache had been moved. Sarah leaned forward, her face pale with realization. Because it was never moved. They just hid it better. Martinez nodded grimly. Robert Hendricks was discovered and killed before he could report that the Brotherhood had built a false wall in the basement, concealing their materials behind what appeared to be original construction. The FBI searched the basement, but never thought to look for hidden chambers behind the walls. She pulled out a final document, this one bearing a recent date stamp. We've been conducting interviews with surviving family members of known Brotherhood associates. What we've learned suggests that the group disbanded after Hendricks' death, too paranoid to trust anyone and too frightened to retrieve their materials. They left everything behind and scattered across the country. John stared at the evidence spread before them, trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. So for 60 years, that cache has been sitting in our basement, deteriorating and becoming more dangerous with each passing day. Not just dangerous, Martinez corrected. Actively unstable. Our explosives experts estimate that the materials would have detonated spontaneously within the next 5 to 10 years, regardless of any external triggers. The chemical breakdown was accelerating, and the vibrations from normal household activities were contributing to the instability. The revelation sent a chill through the room. They had been living not just above forgotten explosives, but above a ticking time bomb that had been counting down for decades before they ever set foot in the house. There's one more thing, Martinez said, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. Mrs. Hendricks asked me to give you this. She handed John a sealed envelope with his name written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a brief note from their elderly neighbor. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Cena, Robert told me before he died that the house held dangerous secrets, but I was too frightened to tell anyone. I moved across the street after his death to keep watch, hoping someday someone brave enough would come along to finish what he started. Thank you for giving him peace at last. Margaret Hendricks. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she read the note. She's been watching over that house for 60 years, waiting for someone to discover what her husband died trying to expose. When they finally returned to their home, it felt different in ways that went beyond the obvious signs of the federal investigation. The basement had been thoroughly cleaned and sealed, the hidden chamber filled with concrete, to ensure it could never again harbor dangerous secrets. But more importantly, the oppressive atmosphere that had plagued them from their first night in the house was completely gone. The silence now was natural, peaceful, the kind of quiet they had originally sought when they chose to move away from the city. No mysterious footsteps echoed through the floors below. No midnight knocking disturbed their sleep. No chemical odors seeped through the walls to poison their dreams. On their first night back, as they lay in bed listening to the gentle sounds of wind through the trees and distant owls calling across the forest, Sarah asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. Do you think we can really be happy here, knowing what this house was hiding? John considered the question carefully before answering. I think this house was never trying to hurt us. It was trying to protect us, and everyone else, by making sure someone finally discovered the truth. Robert Hendricks died to expose that secret, and somehow the house remembered. It kept trying to warn people until someone was finally brave enough to listen. 3 months later, they hosted a quiet ceremony in their backyard, attended by Mrs. Hendricks and several FBI agents who had worked on the case. They planted a memorial garden over the spot where the basement chamber had been sealed, with a small plaque honoring Robert Hendricks and the courage it takes to do the right thing even when the cost is everything. The house never made another unexplained sound. It had finally been allowed to rest, its burden lifted after 60 years of keeping a deadly secret safe from the world. And for the first time since moving in, John and Sarah found the peace they had been searching for, not despite their home's dark history, but because they had been brave enough to bring that history into the light where it could finally be laid to rest.